In Parshas Teruma, the Torah begins to describe to us what the Mishkan was to look like. The Mishkan was the tabernacle. It was the building that the Jewish people built and took down and built and took down as they traveled throughout their 40 years in the desert. And in the Mishkan was to be Hashem's presence. Where? Well, the most important vessel in the Mishkan, unquestionably, was the place from which God's presence emanated, and that was the Aron, the Holy Ark. The Aron was made of gold. Although there was wood inside, it was covered on the inside and outside with gold. It had a little piece of gold molding on top. It also had a kapores, a cover which was made of gold, and it had kruvim, angel-like figures, from in between which God's presence would speak to Moshe Rabbeinu. But the most important component of the Aron was what was inside, and that were the two tablets. That was the connection between Kadosh Baruch Hu, God, godliness, and mankind. When Hashem gave Moshe the two tablets upon which the Aseret Adibros, the 10 Commandments, were written and given to the Jewish people on Har Sinai, on Mount Sinai, as Hashem revealed himself to us and made us his people, these two tablets, these luchos, were placed inside of the Aron. Now the Aron was moved as the Mishkan was moved. And so on the sides of the Aron were rings. There were 4 rings, and in each ring, respectively, on both sides, there were poles that were placed, 2 poles. And there's a very interesting halacha as part of this mitzvah of the Aron, which is, the Torah says, "B'tabaos ha'aron yihiyu habadim lo yasuru mimenu," that after these poles were originally placed inside of these rings, the halacha was that the poles may never be removed. Now, one would think that if the purpose of the poles was to carry the Aron when Mishkan was in transit, then when the Mishkan was not in transit and the Aron was sitting where it was supposed to sit, one would think that one should remove the poles since they were no longer needed. The Torah says, the poles could never be removed. Why is that the case? So the Meshech Chochmah explains to us that we can find an answer by looking at a different halacha also regarding the Mishkan, and that is the halacha regarding the menorah. We're told that the menorah was lit, the candles were lit every morning, baboker. Now, why would they be lit in the morning? If one would think that the reason that we had candles was to illuminate the Mishkan, why would they be lit in the morning if it was sunny outside? And so the Meshech Chochmah explains that the menorah was not lit for illumination. The menorah was lit because Hashem wanted the menorah to be lit in the Mishkan. We don't have the real, incredibly deep reason why the menorah was lit. Simply, Hashem wanted us to light the menorah. And to show that it wasn't for the purposes of having light, Hashem said, light it in the morning. Baboker. And so too, he says, the same can be applied to the badim, the poles of the Aron. We're told that the Aron actually, although the Kohanim surrounded it and seemed as if they were carrying the Aron, but the Aron was actually carried itself. Miraculously, the Aron was never lifted. The Aron was never carried. It only appeared as if the Aron were carried and there were poles on the side, but the poles were never used because through a miracle, the Aron was able to travel on its own. And so Hashem says, never take the poles out of the rings attached to the Aron, because you would have thought that the reason was that we had poles in order to carry, but that's not the reason why the poles were there. The reason why the poles were there is simply because that's the way Hashem wanted it to be. And although we may not understand the true reason, we understand that that is our task, to do what it is that Hashem requests of us. Meshech Chochmah therefore stresses that there are reasons that Hashem has for things, for details that he requests of us, that we do not know or understand. Yes, of course, there are many mitzvos that we are fortunate to understand, but there are other mitzvos and details that Hashem asks us to keep, and we don't know the reasons for them. We nevertheless follow everything that Hashem asks of us, even though we may not understand. And this is the representation of the ultimate example of faith. Faith means to follow even though we don't know why it is that we're doing a certain thing. All that is needed, all that is good enough for a person of faith is to know that it is in essence what Hashem wants us to do, and therefore we follow. That's the important lesson as to why the Badim, according to Meshech Chochmah, why the poles were never removed from the Aron. That's the lesson and the reason why the menorah was lit in the morning, because we don't have all the answers as to why Hashem wants His world to be a certain way. But as Jews, as people who follow His path and follow the Torah, we are there to do what He asks of us, even though we may not always understand the reasons. Thank you for listening and have a good Shabbos.